We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, James Kinney. He is the Global Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer and North American Chief People Officer at Ogilvy. James, thanks for being here with us today. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, thank you, Christina. I really appreciate it. Shout out to the All Voices community and you and your whole team and staff. It's a pleasure to be here for sure. So I'm a bit new in defining this, and I have people that keep asking me the why behind it. But my pronouns are we, our, us, and I will unpack that later in the interview.
Okay.
But I do identify as male as well. So to get into a little bit of the question about what I wanted to be when I grew up, I grew up memorizing speeches from Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, and leadership was something that I found myself in on a regular basis. The way that I would describe it is at a very young age, if there was a ball in the middle of a circle of children, I found myself to be inclined to go get the ball, but to pass it to someone else, right? So I was dishing out assist, if you will, helping others and empowering others. And I really got excited about it at a very early age, empowering others to live their best lives in just the very simplest forms. And I remember one time there was a high school play, and I took myself out of a role so that a female could get the star role. And I remember the feeling of how satisfactory that felt for someone else to get a chance to shine. And
Mhm.
it's just been a feeling that I've been addicted to for the longest time ever. So now I'm really fortunate that I'm in a position where at Ogilvy, I get to allow 14,000 people to shine. And then across the advertising industry and across the business community, I help hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people shine through my writings, my recordings, my books, and of course the day job of leading Ogilvy and parts of WPP.
Incredible. I mean, helping people shine, what better job is there out there? And you touched on this uh, a little bit from childhood up to right now in terms of, passing the mic and your really passion for helping folks and shining a light on their work. But how do you think that your personal journey has really led you up into this point to lead the global diversity, equity, and inclusion and North American people team at Ogilvy specifically?
Yeah, I spent about 7 years in law coming out of college, and then about 8 years in consulting. So the law background, which was HR and marketing, gave me the ability to really see employees as the customer, right? That I knew early on, actually what this is like a sales gig that, if you're recruiting, you're, asking someone to come work with you and you have to deliver on that promise. But once someone starts at a company, it's like a marketing gig because you're remarketing the fact that they're there, which is like retention and staying. And not a lot of people see the nexus of those two conversations, that it's sales to get people in the door, and then it's marketing to keep them there. So I think me being a marketer really helped me understand the importance of how the relationship goes. And then in consulting, I work with about 30 different companies. And what consulting teaches you is you have to create value fast. And that has allowed me to lead, Giant Spoon and Mother and in lots of top agencies,
Mhm.
but to create cultural impact fast and to be really creative in how you go about assessing culture. I did some training at UCLA and at Stanford as well to help me understand the academic and the science of changing and converting culture. But all that led me to this position at Ogilvy, which really has been the biggest platform of my career, but also the biggest opportunity based off the size. So, in North America, we have about 2,300 folks that I'm responsible for in the USA and Canada. And there's a lot of fantastic people that were thirsty for change. Andy Main became our new global CEO. We changed leadership really across the world. So it was a ripe opportunity. And Andy said to me in particular, hey, I want you to come in and really be innovative
Mhm.
in people practices. So I guess that's why we're having the conversation of like innovating the workplace and innovating culture.
Yeah, definitely what we want to talk about. I know from talking to so many leaders that business as usual is not cutting it anymore. We need to be innovative, we need to be creative about especially creating equitable workplaces. I mean, you mentioned it in terms of 2,300 people, a lot of folks in your role. You're leading both diversity, equity, inclusion, and people teams. Some folks at other organizations have the teams either separate or a different kind of structure. How do you really encourage and operationalize collaboration between all of these goals, initiatives, and things like that?
Yeah, well, it was interesting, right? Because like I interviewed for 3 different roles at
Mhm.
Ogilvy, and then Andy came back and was like, "Hey, will you do them both? Because I want you to have the authority from an HR policy perspective to be effective." And you know, DEI and HR are really 2 different worlds. Some organizations make them one world, and he said, I really think that you'll have the ability to have, again, the presence and the authority you need if they're combined. And he's really been right with that assessment. So the way that I go about it is, well, number one, every DEI leader is different in
Mhm.
how they approach it.
Absolutely.
There is, my mentor is like a Bo Young Lee from Uber, just to give a shout out to her. She's been doing this since the 80s.
Yeah.
So when you meet with legends of the game, so to speak, in the DEI space, they had to leave with unconscious bias training, which a lot of people didn't really understand what that was, or
Yeah.
harassment training, or but there was so much that they were fighting for back then. When, I mean, no disrespect to any of the legacy DEI leaders, but I think a lot of CEOs said, well, if I have a diversity problem, excuse me, if I have a diversity person, then that problem is solved.
Hmm.
But what they failed to see is that there needed to be a change from the janitor to the CEO and from the CEO to the janitor, right?
Hmm.
And there needed to be a change horizontally across departments, that every single leader needed to have a stake in the game with what the DEI conversation was. And as a matter of fact, speaking of my global role, my call before this one was with a colleague out of Ireland. And one thing that I said to her on the call is, well, first you must define what DEI means for you in Ireland, because
Absolutely.
it's not the same in Latin America and it's not the same in North America. So in the US in particular, we make it so much of a racial conversation, which it is and can be. But one thing that I try to do differently is open people's aperture up to what the DEI conversation is holistically. So, for example, we're doing a special summit on inclusive product and service design.
Yeah.
There's a whole new frontier, right? So when we talk about, again, accessibility, most people think accessibility refers to a person with difference in ability and their ability to have access to something. But
Mhm.
then you also have to stop and go, oh, well, what if I'm not able to access something because economically I can't? Or based off my education, I can't, or based off my skin color, I can't. So there's all these intersectionalities that exist within the DEI conversation. So what I try to do is lead our clients and our people specifically in 2 areas, from a judicial perspective and a economic perspective,
Mhm.
right? So that's what makes me in particular a little different, is that I'm really heavy on those 2 aspects. I have colleagues who are PhDs in DEI, and they're really big on the behavioral aspects and the psychological aspects. And there's a lot of great DEI leaders, but how each of us tend to approach it is very different. So the way that I've gone about leading the judicial and economic side of DEI is something I created called the Force,
Mhm.
which was covered in Ad Week and Ad Age and Campaign. And the Force is a $75 billion economic collective of companies like Airbnb, Calm, and et cetera, that I brought on board. And we're tackling pay equity in a way that it's never been tackled before. So, for example, pay equity was traditionally thought of as by gender only,
Right.
and it wasn't typically thought of as discrimination. So, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act,
Mhm.
employment discrimination basically stops at get a job or not, fired or not. But what I said in the brief that I wrote is let's expand Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to include pay discrimination on the basis of gender and on the basis of race and on the basis of a person's ability or veteran status, right? So then that sets up a conversation to where when you're at work and you say, hey, you know, I'm AAPI or I'm Black or however you choose to identify, and
Right.
I'm not making the same as X person, that changes everything, right?
Absolutely.
So anyway, so uh, without going too long, that kind of takes you through the roadmap of like how I'm doing it and like what the mindset is. On the on the CPO side of my role, it's more that, you know, I have a responsibility along with my CFO and my CEO and my chief of comms to lead the culture. And what that means is how I behave myself, how I communicate, and how I holistically see managing the culture of Ogilvy throughout North America.
Right.
And when we manage the culture as a team and as a unit, it really goes back to the belonging and the inclusion piece. So I feel like with the DEI piece, I'm more like pushing the agenda and I'm pushing outward, and there's talent acquisition and there's lots of aspects of it. But with the chief people officer role, it's more about like, hey, you have a safe home and a safe place to be where you can thrive. So they really do kind of support each other and
Absolutely.
how I go about both of the teams and both of those business units.
Absolutely. I appreciate you outlining that too. I think those goals are inherently tied together. And also the fact that DI practitioners and kind of legends, as you call them as well, are different in their approaches. I appreciate that economic piece as well, because that is so utterly important to highlight. And I want to go back to something you kind of were talking about too, in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion being different in North America than it's different than Ireland, than it's different than kind of other places.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other thoughts you kind of have around what elements of Ogilvy's, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy need to be global and what needs to stay kind of local when you're defining what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, so the way that we've approached it is that we have a few programs and initiatives that are global frameworks,
Okay.
meaning that, you know, if you go to the container store, if you will, here's the container that it fits in,
Mm-hmm.
and here's the shape and the size. But when we drop that down to the 5 regions, this is how it should be customized in order to be bespoke to you. So I'll give Latin America as example.
Okay.
In Latin America, Mexico and Brazil are completely different.
Mm-hmm.
The first obvious reason is that the language, right? So there's speaking Spanish and then Portuguese. But in particular in Brazil, race is an issue because Brazil is super diverse. Even though everyone speaks Portuguese, there are black Brazilians because of their African origin. There are huge amounts of European origin Brazilians as well through their roots of Italy, Germany, etc. So the color spectrum, if you will, in Brazil is super diverse. So race is so much more of a conversation, whereas in Mexico or Colombia, it may be more of a conversation of somewhat fair skin and or darker skin, but it's more of a class conversation
Yeah.
of what class system that you're born in, but also indigenous and or not. So there's the European roots associated with those societies do tend to be more higher up on the societal rankings, if you will, and the indigenous, going back to the Aztecan and the Mayan, tend to not be as favored. But it's not an outright race conversation per se in those markets. It somewhat is, but nowhere like it is in Brazil. So then if you go down to Argentina, where we have people as well, again, the race conversation is not really a race conversation. It's a class conversation. It's absolutely a gender conversation as well. It is an ability conversation. Yes. It is an LGBTQ plus conversation. Yes. But it's not the same in every single market. So even when I take a global framework and we break it down to Latin America, it still needs to be bespoke within Latin America because Latin America itself is diverse. Going over to the Europe, Mideast, Asia region, or our Asia Pacific region, it as well, it gets even more diverse in Asia Pacific than it does in Latin America. So to uh, to concisely wrap that up, it's about having malleable global frameworks that we can operate in, right? That give people the big idea for
Mhm.
Ogilvy as an organization, yet having the customization where HR teams and DEI teams and business leaders can locally adapt that.
I love that. I also like the analogy of the container store. I think that's a beautiful place and gives people an example of what to visualize as well. It sounds like getting really specific, having that foundation, but doing the research to see what conversations really need to be had and being intentional around that as well. And specifically around Ogilvy as an organization, I mean, I think there's a huge role in the advertising industry, in the organization playing a huge kind of role, setting an example of what it looks like to be an equitable and creative kind of workplace. But what are your thoughts around kind of the role of Ogilvy there and kind of the impact you can have on the industry? As we know, it has changed. I mean, everybody has seen Mad Men, all these places. We're seeing more inclusive
Mhm.
ads and just more engagement there, which I think is great, but would love to know your thoughts.
Well, it's huge. Like we are constantly pushing our clients. If you think about the collective influence that our clients have, it is absolutely tremendous in scale. We just had a conversation last week about, driving more change, and one of the ways that we're looking at doing that is through our top 25 clients. So as the 2022 agenda comes to life, there's one way to look at it, right? So if we cut the cake one way, it's like, yeah, it's by region through internal efforts. But a bigger way potentially is our top 25 clients, because I probably shouldn't say the client names here on the podcast, but it's kind of easy to see who our top 25 clients are. They're huge, 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 huge companies. So I've already had conversations with about 7 or 8 of them this year, and some of the companies that I've spoke to literally, you know, have billions of customers. So if we take those top 25 clients and say, hey, here's what we're doing at Ogilvy in order to make sure that our workplace is equitable and it's a place where people belong. This is how we see diversity. What are you doing at your organization, which many of them are? And this is how we work together across CMOs, CEOs, DEI chiefs, just a lot more than diversity and HR people, but business leaders. We can make incredible strides that way through that top 25 client list, even the top 10. I
Yeah.
mean, the companies are so big. So going back to that inclusive product service and design conversation, I was on with one of our pharma clients, and it was like a 4-hour virtual town hall, and I was so impressed what they were doing with how they looked at skin tone and packaging, and some folks are colorblind, so they may not be able to see packaging the same way. When someone walks into an on-premise environment, do they feel inclusive in the store layout, right? Like one of our clients is one of the biggest retailers in the world. So when you walk into the store, and I'll just give you an example of one of the things that I said verbatim in this conversation. I said, as one of the executives on this call, when I'm looking for a certain product, I already know what to do because the market has trained me. I go to the back of the store and I look at the very bottom of the shelf.
Mhm.
And I've gotten over it and I'm kind of used to it. But I said to them, how do you think that makes me feel? You know what I mean? That my audience, and I know there's only so much space on the shelves, there's only so much stuff in the store, but I already know it's
Right.
just not available because of my hair type. So I just know, go to the back of the store, look at the bottom of the shelf, and maybe there's 2 or 3 bottles of it.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And how many different people in different ways? If I identify as Jewish, if I identify as gay, if I identify as having PTSD. I mean, there's lots of different ways that I can identify. And then, as you know, the intersectionality, maybe identify as 9 different things. Like I did this big insurance company chat with all these executives, and I talked to them about intersectionality and like, how do you develop strategies to compensate for the feeling of intersectionality? And it was really important to have that chat.
I think that's definitely important because you can never put someone into this one box, and everybody has different lived and learned experiences as well. So intersectionality is a huge piece of this conversation. And in terms of customer reach, it sounds like you can make a huge impact in the work that you're doing, which is really important. Inclusive design is also something that a lot of companies are thinking about. If we're kind of bringing this to an internal perspective, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about, the great resignation that everyone is talking about in terms of people really thinking about what they want to spend 40, maybe 60 hours a week doing. I think there's one study that says 55% of Americans anticipate looking for a new job for a variety of different reasons. Has your retention strategy changed over this past year as you're thinking about these stats? How are you thinking of really engaging folks?
Yeah, so I developed a framework to tackle it in the most simple way possible, right? So we were, thinking about how do we go about this. We know that COVID has impacted it tremendously. Work from home has, Zooming, etc., has impacted it tremendously. So I just said, you know what? Let's go top to bottom. And let's talk about culture, right? Which is people's perception. The technical definition of culture is thoughts, actions, behaviors, and values of an organization, of a group of people in its most simple form. But we talked about culture, care, right? How much we go into genuinely caring about people, their careers, meaning an upward growth path, right? And the clarity of what that looks like. And then cash, how much that we're paying people. Yeah, exactly. So through those 4 C's, that's a very simple way to look at that framework. It allows us to, sometimes when you're diagnosing a challenge, you have to separate it in order to make sense of it. So we separated those 4 in order to look at that, okay, care. How are we actually caring? So I have a pending deal with a large mental health provider that'll be out soon. And I'm taking 1,000 of our managers through a very bespoke program. Number 1, to say that we care, and number 2, to say if I can't or we can't be there for every single person because of the size of the organization, you still have to go about it in some sort of systematic way. So impacting 1,000 people and enabling those 1,000 people to we care about you, and then we're teaching you how to care for others. That's how you create that systematic culture of caring, right? Because again, there's not one doctor that can change everything for a medical based society, but if we teach people how to be preventative with healthcare, that's how we get there, right? So it's like it's the same kind of thinking. And then on the career side, we have something called Career Conversations that we launched back in January. And it's making sure that twice a year, people have very specific conversations about their career and upward mobility and growth. And then, of course, cash is giving people raises on a regular basis. So that's been our, I'm not going to say solution, because no one has the solution. Tesla doesn't have it. Google doesn't have it. People still want to move around and change because it's where we are in the world. But it's our solution to saying we have a systematic way and we are answering the call, right? And then what I say to people straight up is that, hey, if you're thinking about leaving, I respect it, but at least give me a call and let me try.
Absolutely. I think that's about kind of building trust with folks as well, and really breaking it down for a framework. And again, systemic change, which is very important. And there are ways that you can take steps to make that systemic change by breaking it down into those buckets as you outlined. I know at the top of the call, we talked about your experience in creating these innovative policies, whether it's, people strategies and inclusion strategies too. Are there any other kind of, things that you're making more equitable, processes that you're changing that you really want to kind of highlight, maybe to share as best practices for folks, or, any kind of favorites there that's not business as usual?
Well, yeah, I think one more that's getting a lot of love, so to speak. And yeah, and thank you for highlighting the innovation that I've been fortunate to bring to the table. And I just want to acknowledge that this is a big team effort. Fortunate to be creative in my thinking, but it takes a village to pull all this off. So I work across many teams and many departments, and we all do this work together. So I want to be mindful to acknowledge the Ogilvy teams across the board that bring all this to life. But the other one is called Careers and Coffee, and the first one was called Careers and Coffee with Creatives, and I stole it from the Jerry Seinfeld thing on Netflix of comedians and cars getting coffee.
Yeah.
So I developed a talent acquisition virtual event because I just was like, man, like virtual job fairs kind of suck and it sounds kind of lame, and like it's like, okay, virtual job fair, woo, woo, because job fairs are really awkward anyway. Like I remember how job fairs were like when we weren't in COVID. So I was like, what people want is just like a real authentic view of what it's like on the inside. Because as a potential employee, all you get is like, oh, what is it like to work at Google? What is it really like to work at Facebook? If I was at Chase Bank, what is it really like? You know what I mean? And what people are always referring to is like, what's the culture really like, right? So I got together with 3 CCOs and we just asked them like questions, nothing about work, like flavors of ice cream. If you could work with a guest celebrity creative director, who would it be? And it was hilarious. Like people are like, oh, I hate working with celebrities, or I want to work with Justin Timberlake, and it was just cool. Like, and we had 100 people show up from the internet off LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And people got a chance to really get to know our CCOs as human beings. And I think that kind of like stigma busting, you know what I mean? Like when people meet me, I don't want you to think, oh my God, he's global chief and double chief. I don't want people to, because number one, I don't act like that. But number two, if you come here and you work in the trenches with us, I just want you to know what it's really going to be like. I'll let you know that the imperfections and the great things that we have to offer, right? So we've now taken that series. We're on our third one. So coming up on September 9th, we'll be featuring our Pride community and LASIK, which is one of our specialty business companies. So it's super dope. Like going back to DEI, and now this is a good exhibit of how weave both roles together.
Sure.
I had 4 Black women in completely different departments and completely different businesses featured on one of the last Careers in Coffee. And honestly, Ogilvy started in 1948. I don't think that's ever happened before, that 4 Black women were featured. And it was but it was dope because I didn't market it as 4 Black women. It's just 4 professionals who are awesome, who happen to identify as female and happen to identify as Black, but they're just dope ass professionals. And they were able to tell their story, talk through like, what's it like to be a strategist. And again, if we continue to approach things like what I just said, we can just make things more normal. Like, why does it have to be like, oh, I'm, right? It's like, I did a post on LinkedIn because I remember the CEO of the New York Stock Exchange. She was the first female, and she was like, thank you, but I just hope that there's a day where we don't have to celebrate the fact that I'm the first woman. Like, I'm qualified, I'm here, I got the role, right? So I think that's another thing to feature. So now it's just called Careers in Coffee because it's not just creatives.
Not just creatives. I love that. And I think that's important as well to highlight and to reframe in our minds. Go ahead.
Well, totally. Yeah. Because the advertising industry, you might only feature creatives, right? Because they tend to be the highest paid. But yeah, we got producers, we got strategists, we got HR people, finance people. Yeah.
A lot of people behind the curtain.
Yeah.
We're talking about a lot of strategies that you've implemented with your team and that, people can take with them too in terms of best practices. Sure. Lots of folks always have questions around good old ROI, return on investment, and how you measure success, how you measure progress. Again, not thinking of it as ticking the box, one and done, people retention, diversity, equity, inclusion strategies. But when you're thinking about measuring, company culture, what qualitative and quantitative KPIs are you looking at to say, okay, we're doing a good job in this area. We still need to keep going, but what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, culture is measured by retention for sure. If people are staying, then you're saving money and you have continuity within the business. So that's a one quick, clear metric because it costs money to replace people, right? So that's one clear metric. From a sentiment place, we do quarterly pulse surveys now, and I'm happy to say that 84% of our people globally felt that we've taken DEI seriously and they appreciate it being a priority. So those numbers speak for themselves. Um, Careers in coffee, I mean, I think there's outside recruiter costs that go down and or non-existent. There's KPIs for how many people show up for those events. There's KPI for how big that pipeline is now, how I'm able to convert out of that pipeline. So we've actually hired people from that event. So I mean, that just shows that it's real, right? So it's like we can have our talent acquisition folks just skimming through LinkedIn for days, or we can go out and talk to people. I kind of say that's the like evangelizing of culture. It's like it's easy to sit behind a screen and again just scroll LinkedIn, but go talk to people, build some relationships. So
Absolutely. I think those are good, both qualitative and quantitative metrics to look at.
yeah,
And the fact
yeah,
that people are getting a lot of the conversations that you're curating and attending them as well. And the people that are currently at Ogilvy are enjoying the kind of company culture and see the bigger picture. What is top of mind for you right now in terms of, current state? What problem are you trying to solve? What's taking up
mental health
great
all
space?
day.
Health. All right, let's talk about it. Mental health.
Yeah.
The mental health of your team.
Um, it is a pervasive and broad problem for all of us. I did a pretty big LinkedIn post that went into this and shared my thoughts in particular. And I think that there's two ways that we have to really go about this solution. Number one is the individual's responsibility to put up a boundary and to take responsibility for their health. I've never met a computer that a person was chained to, but psychologically they are.
Right.
So what I tell people all the time, literally as your chief people officer, if things get too rough, close the computer,
Yeah.
go take a walk.
Mhm.
Do not take your phone with you. And it's a big problem as a society that people don't feel comfortable taking that. Like literally work from home. So here's what happened. Work from home never had any rules. Work from home, we weren't set up for this. So if I feel that I'm obligated to be here from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. because something might come through, I mean, of course, I'm really going to be out of whack very, very fast.
Yeah.
So when I tell people you have my full permission, close the computer, don't take the phone, don't get up, move your body, right? So first it's the person, then it is the organization. We have to create environments where people can thrive. And if we don't be a little, I'm not going to call it big brothery, but we have to set up enough frameworks and enough professional boundaries that across the culture, we know, okay, what are three non-negotiables, right? So I'm actually working on a plan that will be in the press soon, so I don't want to spoil it here, but I have a plan that Devika, our North American CEO, has approved, and I wrote a plan of what our non-negotiables are.
Mhm.
And that's the organization's job, right? So on both sides of on both sides of that coin, that's what it is. It's the person's individual responsibility to close the computer. No, nothing is going to happen. Close the computer. And then the other part of that is, what are the non-negotiables of the organization? And those kind of things are, everyone gets a lunch, at least 30 minutes. If
Yeah.
we live in a world where people cannot at least have 30 minutes to eat,
That's
something's
a
wrong,
problem. Yeah.
right? There's at least one day per weekend that you're completely off. Every Saturday, every Sunday, whatever it is. If some people want to grind, you know, catch up on that Saturday, cool. Catch up on your emails on a Sunday, okay, cool. But working 7 days in a row, for 21 days straight, we're not celebrating that.
Yeah.
Non-negotiable, right?
Mhm.
Calling someone with oops, I'm sorry, I know it's 10 p.m. and you're asleep. Nope, non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable.
So it's those kind of things that I think we've made this thing. I mean, we in society, we've made this thing creep into this big ugly monster when this is pretty simple, folks. And it's a client conversation, it's an internal conversation, and it's an employee-led conversation as well. So I find myself to be the instigator of this conversation and the facilitator of these solutions.
Absolutely. And I think that's important to highlight as well, that there are ways that the organization and leaders can really hold themselves accountable and create those non-negotiables. And then you as an individual can create those good old healthy boundaries, professional boundaries with work as well. You
Yeah.
mentioned this at the beginning of the call too, around how you see kind of, people changing, and we've seen so many kind of roles in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and more people roles, really folks treating employees as customers and changing the employee experience. Are there any other changes you've seen in the people and DEI
Yeah.
space in the kind of 18 plus years, whether it's positive, negative, or anything in between?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of companies right now are giving people, a full week off at a time. I mean, I'm loving seeing that from Nike, the, some local agencies here in LA, and across, and we've given our people multiple extra days off too, to tack on to the big weekends. So I'm loving seeing more frequent and regular rest as a part of culture. I'm loving the open conversations on mental health led through companies like Calm, et cetera. I think those are great. And I love that mental health is now part of the DEI conversation as well, right? That that mental health is not just like a employee assistance program thing or an HR thing. It's a business leader thing. It's a DEI thing. So kind of like what I said in another one of my posts on LinkedIn is I said, the problem that we're having is that we made mental health a your problem versus a we are us problem, going back to my pronoun.
Yeah,
That I believe that if we make it a we are us problem, we're going to solve it quick.
exactly. Opening up
You know
those
what I mean?
too. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's kind of like the homeless problem in LA or New York or any major city. If you just drive by it and you just see a person laying on the ground, and it's like, that's them over there,
Right.
that's not me, or that's their problem, or that's
Mhm.
that's the city's job to solve that, or that's, I mean, there's a lot of things in this world that we could change again if it was a we our us problem.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
that's where that thinking comes from.
That is like a reframing of how we think about things. And I think that's a good example too of just how
Yeah.
sometimes people separate themselves, whether you're thinking about someone as, oh, it's their problem, like I have nothing to do with it too, and thinking about it as a whole system and how we're in it together too. And the power of community is really important. And I think that goes back to what you said earlier in terms of you really from an early age, like really helping people and kind of shining a light on what they're doing. So definitely a common thread throughout kind of your career as well.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would like to share that maybe I didn't ask in our conversation, or 1 to 2 key takeaways you hope listeners bring with them after listening to our podcast? I have a feeling I might have some ideas, but what are your thoughts?
Mhm. Well, yeah, I would just say, I encourage everyone to be in touch with me. Follow me on Instagram. It's just at James Nicholas Kinney. And then it's Nicholas. And then Kinney is Kinney. And the reason why I say that is that I'm actually doing something about it. I recorded 52 weekly affirmations that include mindfulness and meditation for absolutely free. And I'm redoing my website right now. So as of October, anyone in the world, and they'll also be on Spotify, every Monday morning, when you start your day, you can get a weekly affirmation and meditation from me. And it's only like 3 to 5 minutes, short and sweet for a reason. But I just wanted to give back and give something to the workplace community as a whole. So I look forward to everybody receiving those affirmations and just joining together as a community, regardless of where you work or regardless of what your title is. I just wanted to do something to put out good, free, not content, but solutions, right? This goes beyond content. This is an actual solution that I'm giving folks.
Absolutely. Democratizing information and accessibility
There you
is,
go.
especially in the mental health resources
That,
space.
yeah,
So,
that is an equity thing right there. Exactly.
exactly.
Yeah, you don't have to pay for it. It's here, it's quality. Let's join together.
Absolutely. James, thank you so much for being on
Thank
Reimagining Company
you.
Culture. I enjoyed our conversation this afternoon.
Thanks, Christina. It's really nice to meet you, meet you, and I look forward to meeting you in Brooklyn at some point in person.
Yes, absolutely. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, AllVoices and myself believe in the power of employee feedback management, and we know it's a requirement in order for the company to succeed as a whole. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.